Republicans are tough, wholesome, and for small government is not supported by the evidence. He says that Americans have bought into these fictions because Republicans have run very successful propaganda campaigns that are echoed by right-wing media outlets and accepted as truth by more mainstream sources. The event, hosted by Olson's Books in Washington, D.C., is 75 minutes.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to begin by thanking everybody for coming here tonight. I'm actually at the very beginning of my book tour because the book was just released yesterday, and as a result I'm still very enthusiastic about attending events like this and talking about my book. 2 weeks from now I would be slightly less enthusiastic, so it's a good night, and I am excited to be here and start the discussion that I was hoping that the book would provoke. One of the challenges that I have as somebody who writes a daily column about political matters is trying to find the time to step back and grapple with some of the issues that are sort of perplexing. When you write every day, you tend to write about the things about which there's some degree of certainty. And there's always questions that perplexes you, that perplex you, that you're sometimes unable to really examine in a deliberative way when you're writing under the pressure of churning out a column in essence every single day. And for me, writing books is an opportunity to take a step, or hopefully more, back and look at things from a broader perspective and try and grapple with some of the questions that I think are difficult to answer. And I've tried with each of my books, this is my third one, to have the genesis of the book be some question that I think is interesting and important, but at the same time difficult to answer without thinking about in a systematic and thorough way. And for me, the question that prompted the current book that we're here to discuss tonight is the following. If you look at polling data over the last several decades, really beginning with 1980, what you find is a pretty decisive edge that Democrats or liberals or progressives have in terms of pure policy positions. That is, if you ask the American public what their position is with regard to specific policy questions, virtually across the board, with very few exceptions, the public will side with what the Democrat or progressive or liberal position is, far more so than the conservative position. Despite that fact, the conservatives, the right wing in this country, have more or less dominated our national elections over that same, say, 30-year period, over the last several decades. And understanding that discrepancy, why is it that the political faction whose views by and large are rejected by a majority of Americans nonetheless has had such great success politically in terms of our national elections, was something that I've been thinking about for quite some time and is actually not all that easy to answer. I mean, it's counterintuitive, obviously. One assumes that the political faction with the views that appeal to the most number of Americans would be the political faction that would attain the most success, and the reverse has been true in our political culture. And so what I think that I found, and what I hope that I make a good case for in this book, is the explanation for that discrepancy. And that explanation rests in the fact that our elections are not determined by a substantive consideration of the weightiest issues that our country faces, but instead are overwhelmed, swamped with all sorts of petty, personality-based and kind of insipid themes that are outcome determinative almost universally. And I think if you go back and look at elections beginning in 1980, you see the same theme that we're seeing right now as of today. I mean, if you look at the Republican brand right now, it's probably never been more sullied, more discredited as a result of the last 8 years. And yet, the candidate who is closely tied to virtually every one of those radical and destructive policies, virtually no deviation except in very minor cases, is someone who in virtually every public opinion poll is either tied with or slightly ahead of or slightly behind either of the two potential Democratic nominees, notwithstanding the fact that the country overwhelmingly believes that that political party has led the country profoundly in the wrong direction, has led us into a recession, has led us into an unparalleled disaster and occupation in Iraq, and across the board is deeply dissatisfied with the political party that John McCain is a part of and tied to and has supported, and yet by all rights, he ought to be behind 15, 20, 25 points in the poll, and yet he's in essence tied. I mean, that makes no sense if you operate on the premise that our political elections are determined by the citizenry's view of political issues. There was a similar situation back in 1988 after late years of the Reagan administration, where, contrary to the way in which Ronald Reagan has been canonized, the country was by and large very tired of and dissatisfied with Reaganomics and the Republican brand of governing. And as a result, when George Bush I announced that he was going to run for president, he was something like 15 to 20 points behind in every public opinion poll, despite the fact that his opponent was a fairly unknown governor from Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, and yet that George Bush, despite how tired and dissatisfied with Republicans the country was, ended up winning the election by a fairly sizable majority, and that's similar to the path that we're on right now. And asking and understanding why that is, I think, is of the utmost importance. What happened in 1988 was that Roger Ailes and Lee Atwater, who were running George Bush I's campaign, understood that they were not going to win on the merits of the issues because the country had soured on the Republican ideology. And so they decided very early on in their campaign documents and memoranda and insider accounts that demonstrate that this is the case, that the election needed to turn on a cultural, tribalistic, personality-grounded framework, and that the idea was that George Bush I would be built up as this personality icon and Michael Dukakis would be demonized. And those themes that were used very successfully to do that Dukakis was an elitist, that he was out of touch with the common heartland values, that he waged war on and did not believe in defining American principles, that he was weak, that he was a loser, that he was effete, incapable of protecting Americans from criminals, from foreign threats. And that George Bush was this combat hero who showed that he was strong when he defied Dan Rather in an interview and started using salty Texan language that was foreign to him but that he had been taught and that had been inculcated with him, really turned the election around. And to this day, Americans know about Michael Dukakis virtually nothing about his record, but they know that he looked like a loser when he wore a helmet riding around in the tank, and that he didn't show sufficient manly rage when asked hypothetically what he would do if his wife were raped and murdered. And similar instances like that that are purely grounded in personality were things that the American public knew about Michael Dukakis and recoiled from. And that is the template over and over and over and over that the right has used successfully to win elections, irrespective of what the public thinks about their substantive issues. And that is exactly the template that they're gearing up to use today, this year. It's their only chance to win. And one of the reasons why I'm excited about the book being released this week is because I think that the last couple of weeks have illustrated this thesis as vividly as anything I could have ever hoped for. I mean, the book examines not only these themes that the right propagates, but also the media's critical complicity with disseminating them and ensuring that our elections are decided by these themes. And if you look at the news cycles for the past several weeks, it's really extraordinary, the issues that have dominated our political discussions. It began about 2.5, 3 weeks ago when Barack Obama went bowling in Pennsylvania, and he threw gutter balls and was a horrible bowler. And the media decided that this demonstrated that he was someone who was out of touch with the regular folk about whom the media stars know a great deal and can speak for them. And because they're at bowling alleys all the time, of course. And when Barack Obama showed that he wasn't, that showed that he was some sort of exotic, bizarre, elitist, out of touch with American values and therefore unqualified to be president. And that theme was knocked off the front page and off the pundit mind only when Obama gave his now famous or infamous comments in San Francisco, which I don't know if you know this or not, that's the capital of elitism. In America, he was in San Francisco and he made his comments about religion and guns and economic insecurity and the relationship between those things. And literally, it's been a week now where the headlines are dominated by discussions of these same themes. We're a country that, as I indicated, is on the verge of, if not in, a severe recession, has fundamental problems in terms of our credibility, our resources, our security, our strength, our political values, across the board, profound problems, and yet none of those are visible at all in the way in which the media is covering these events. Instead, what's happening is Obama, because it's presumed that he'll be the nominee at the moment, is being attacked with these same personality themes. Senator Clinton, when she looked to be the presumptive nominee, or was assumed to be the nominee by the pundit class and by the right, was attacked with exactly the same sorts of tactics. I mean, it was, is her laugh indicative of some sort of soulless, satanic, power-hungry, almost inhuman evil that is culturally bizarre? And there was discussion about whether she had showed inappropriate cleavage when she wore certain suits on the floor of the Senate, whether or not she had a 20-year plan to become president. I mean, the types of petty issues that a country enjoying great prosperity and stability might be able to enjoy wallowing in. But a country that has very real political problems would have to be insane in order to focus primarily or exclusively on these issues, and yet that is the nature of our political culture at the moment. And so, to me, the real question, the towering question is not whether or not what I just described is true. I mean, you can demonstrate scientifically with looking at media stories that it's true. You can listen to what reporters say about how they cover campaigns and the way in which their affection personally for a candidate generates positive coverage and their dislike of a candidate's personality generates negative coverage. You can look at the fact that, as I said, there's a huge discrepancy between the political views of the citizenry and the outcome of elections. To know that this dynamic is what is the predominant dynamic and how our political elections are decided. The question that I think is interesting and has to be answered is what, if anything, can be done to undermine that? And that, I think, is a much more difficult question. And ultimately, the answer that I've arrived at, and I'm fairly convinced that it's a persuasive explanation, is that the reason that these personality-themed attacks work is because they're basically one-sided attacks. The Republican or right-wing candidate is built up into this heroic icon, and the Democrat or the liberal candidate is demonized as this sort of perverse and very weak, even gender-confused elitist and loser, and only one side is engaging that battle. And like every battle, like every debate, like every conflict, when only one side engages the battle and the other side just sort of defensively tries to ward it off but doesn't really ever engage, the side that's doing the engaging will always, always, always win. And I think that's what has been happening. And the problem is that engaging this battle is actually an easy task because the iconography that the right uses to build up their leaders is not just petty. I mean, it is incredibly petty. I mean, the idea that strength and moral probity and a belief in limiting federal government in some sort of way that puts them in touch with the regular folk, these are petty images. But more than pettiness is the fact that they're just completely false. The leaders of the right-wing movement who parade around under the banner of these values actually bear no resemblance to those values in their lives. And so if they want to insinuate this framework, these metrics, into our political process, then I think it's important to engage those metrics, talk about those attributes, and put them under that microscope, subject them to the same standards that they themselves are advocating in order to demonstrate that they do not in any way exemplify those values that they claim to exemplify. And you can look at across the board what these themes are. And probably the most significant one is the idea that Republicans and Republican leaders are strong and courageous, and Democrats are weak and irresolute. And what that has come to mean in our political culture is that the Republicans like war. They like to start wars. They like to send other people off to war. They like to continue the wars once they've begun. They think that bombing other countries is a good way to advance policy goals, that it's exhilarating, and that by cheering on war, by believing in war, and an aggressive and belligerent foreign policy, one can demonstrate strength. That's how you show that you're strong. By the converse is then also true, that if you oppose war or you believe that war is something that ought to be avoided except in those extremely rare circumstances where it cannot be, if you believe in alternative methods to resolving America's disputes and fulfilling its goals besides war, then that means in essence that you're weak or cowardly or somehow irresolute. The reality, of course, is that there's nothing strong or courageous about deciding that other people are going to be sent off to war. And yet, that premise is virtually never challenged. One of the examples that I use in the book is that George Bush, the first, when he first decided that he was going to run for president, was dogged by rumors that he was actually a wimp. And Newsweek actually published a cover when he announced that he was going to run for president that announced that he had to battle the wimp factor. Even though he was a combat hero in World War II, he had trouble maintaining that image of strength. And in the first year when he was in office, he ordered the U.S. military, the most powerful military even then, to invade a tiny and defenseless country that could not in any way threaten us or attack us, Panama. We killed several thousand Panamanian civilians. We don't count them, and we don't know exactly how many we killed, but roughly in that area. And the very next day, the New York Times ran a front-page article by R.W. Apple, the New York Times reporter, declaring that Bush had finally shed his wimp image because he fulfilled the rite of passage that all American presidents have to fulfill in order to prove that they're strong, which is a willingness, as he put it, to shed American blood, just essentially a symbolic way of demonstrating that he was a strong leader, was the fact that he was willing to start war. As long as that premise remains in place, and there's no discussion of the fact that there's nothing strong or courageous about sending other people off to war, and that it's often infinitely stronger and more courageous to argue against war, or to impede war, or to stop stupid and destructive wars, then this theme will simply continue. It would have to, because the premise is being unchallenged, and if it's unchallenged, the party that's always the most pro-war party, the most hawkish party, will always be perceived as the strong party, and the party that tends to oppose war, at least marginally more so, will be perceived as the weak party. The other aspect of the strong-weak dichotomy that I think is worth highlighting is the fact that the greatest misconception that Democrats and progressives and liberals, especially in Washington, have had for a very long time is that the reason Republicans are perceived as strong is because they believe in this hawkish foreign policy, and that's strong. And therefore, in order for liberals to avoid appearing weak, what they need to do is to replicate that approach as much as possible, almost to the point where they become carbon copies of it, in order to eliminate this discussion from the political arena, and then the elections can focus on what they perceive to be their strong points, whether that's economic security or social programs and the like. The reality is exactly the opposite of the advice that they've been getting and of the path that they've been taking for decades now. Michael Dukakis, when he first ran for president, had the advice of Susan Estrich, who told him that the most important thing that he could do was to immediately abandon the label liberal and insist that he was not a liberal at all, even though it really seemed like, as governor of Massachusetts, he was the standard classic liberal in every single possible way, that he had to convince the American public that liberal was not anything that he was like. Instead, he was simply a competent technocrat. And since then, Democrats and progressives have been characterized largely by the behavior where they apologize for their own belief system. They run away from the obligation to defend and advocate those beliefs because they believe that those beliefs are what make them appear weak. The reality is it's the running away from those beliefs, the unwillingness to take a stand for what their political values really are, the fact that they lack the courage of their convictions, that is what has made them look weak in the eyes of Americans for so long. And that's something that Republicans on the right have long understood. There's a whole litany of issues where the right has taken positions that were extremely unpopular among American citizens. Impeachment, for example, every single poll showed that overwhelmingly Americans thought that impeachment was a bad idea. And yet Republicans pursued it unapologetically to the very end. If you look now at the Iraq War, The Iraq War is probably the single most unpopular war in American history, if not the most unpopular war, and yet there have been virtually no defections in the Republican steadfastness of supporting that war and of opposing withdrawal, even though it's politically unpopular, because they embrace their position and they stick to it until the end. And that is what makes them look strong, not the specific policies. By contrast, what you have are Democratic strategists telling Democratic politicians that to oppose the war will make them look weak because war opposition is a sign of weakness. And therefore, they can't really follow through on what it is that they think. They can't really stand up to the president in the realm of terrorism or in the realm of war, because to do so will leave them open to charges of being weak, and so they constantly equivocate, and they apologize for what their positions are, and they take tepid stances rather than taking clear stances that are based on political principle, and Americans see them equivocating and see them afraid to take their own positions, and it's then that they look weak, not when they advocate their positions and political values, but when they are afraid to. And so until this changes, until this dynamic changes, George Bush stood up in the 2004 Republican National Convention acceptance speech, by which time he was already an unpopular incumbent, by which time the Iraq War was already unpopular. And the defining line of that acceptance speech was, "You may not always agree with me, but you'll always know where I stand." That was the way in which George Bush tried to present an image of strength, not by taking positions that he thought that Americans liked, but by telling Americans that he would stand firm in support of his values. That is what ultimately strength is about. Not that George Bush really did that, but that he cast that perception that he was doing that, and that's something that Democrats for so long have failed to do. The other themes, and I'll just be much more concise and describe these in summary fashion and then open it up to questions, are even easier to address. I mean, the idea that Republicans stand for the values of mainstream Americans or traditional marriage, when virtually the entire top level of the political leadership lives private lives that couldn't be any further removed from those traditional values that they claim to embrace. The idea that the Republican Party is the party of limited government and standing against government intervention and in favor of individual autonomy and the right of regular Americans to live their lives free of government intervention, when over the last 8 years and during the Reagan years, the government has ballooned in the scope of its power, in its spending, in the reach that it has into the lives of American citizens. We are a country that over the last 8 years has vastly expanded the national security state, the surveillance state, the power of the president to collect data about what Americans do in their private lives, to listen in on them, to read their emails, listen to their conversations without warrants of any kind, without checks. The idea that this is the party of limited government is laughable on its face, and yet that premise too is never challenged. And so the right wing's tactics are effective and they're dishonest. The dishonest part is something that ought not to be replicated, even if it's politically expedient to do. But the effective parts, even when they're petty and lowly and distract from what the issues of, that our country needs to face is something that needs to be directly engaged. And that hasn't happened yet. And the reason it needs to be directly engaged is not because we want to take both sides and drag it down into the muck even further. It's because unless those tactics are engaged and directly addressed, they're going to continue to be effective. They're going to continue to exclude a consideration of substantive issues from our political process. And so the idea of engaging them and not allowing right-wing leaders to build themselves up as these absurd, laughable, deceitful caricatures is not about joining the right down in the mud. It's about neutralizing those tactics, rendering them impotent, so that the election and our political discourse no longer can be decided in this unilateral way down in the mud, but then we'll have to shift out because now those tactics are being neutralized into more substantive areas. And at the very least, to stop this deceit where right-wing leaders prance around as everything except what they really are, while demonizing and destroying the character of any Democratic or progressive or liberal candidate, and ensuring that our elections are won by a political faction that espouses views that are rejected by the overwhelming preponderance of Americans. And that's been happening for several decades, and I think there's no greater challenge, especially now, than finding a way to stop that and to reverse it. And my book is an effort to ask how that can be done and propose some potential solutions. So with that, let me thank you again very much for coming tonight, and I'd be happy to take questions or comments. Yep.
Thank you very much for the talk. And a couple things. Barack Obama has been the recipient lately by his Democratic opponent of some personality attacks. And the way he's responded seems unique for from candidates in the past. And at the present time, they don't seem to be sticking in the way, they might have. Could you just address how he may be different in that way, and how I think part of it is that he does hone to his principles. He never gives in. So in a way, he's not yielding his identity to the attacks, which is what a lot of Democrats have done in the past. So, but if you could address that in terms of how he might fare in a general election. And then the other part is Progressive Talk Radio has many of the Progressive Talk hosts have been not only going after the policy differences that they have with John McCain, but they are starting to do some of that personality. They're trying to turn the tables by doing some of that personality stuff on there. So I was wondering if you could talk about those two issues in terms of their impact.
Those are both great questions. Thank you. With regard to the first, I mean, I've written several times about some exemplary responses that I think Obama has given to some of these attacks. One in particular really struck me, which is when Obama had pretty favorable media coverage up until the point that it seemed like he actually might win. And it was really once the prospect that he might win really sunk in with a lot of people, did this all start getting unleashed. And one of the very first signs of this was the controversy over the fact that he wouldn't wear his lapel pin. And that kind of picked up steam right around the time that his wife had said that this was the first time that she was really proud of the political process in this country. And all of these things were being sewn together to suggest that he hated America. And that too is as standard of an attack as it gets ever since the whole demonization of Jimmy Carter and Michael Dukakis and his card-carrying ACLU membership and his Pledge of Allegiance position and things of that nature. And Obama, what politicians typically do in those situations is if they're caught not wearing a lapel pin, they'll run to put as many American flags around themselves every single time they speak as possible, and they'll be sure to sing patriotic songs every time there's a camera nearby. And what Obama did was the opposite. He said, yes, I'm not wearing a lapel pin anymore because I think these are cheap displays of patriotism. And I think Americans know that patriotism isn't demonstrated by how many lapel pins you wear. Instead, I'm eager to have the debate over what real patriotism is, and I want to have that debate with the party that has dragged us into this destructive war and has dismantled our constitutional values and unraveled everything that has always made America great in terms of our political values. That was a perfect response because he refused to accept the premise that he needed to be on the defensive, and then he went on the attack offensively and said, let's talk about, if patriotism is going to be the metric that they want to inject, let's talk about how that really ought to be applied. And that's exactly the type of thing that I'm talking about needs to be done a lot more. Having said that, I think it really remains to be seen whether or not the idea that you can really kind of remain above these sorts of attacks and not engage in them bilaterally is something that can be sustained for a long period of time. Americans will tell you, if you ask them, that they don't want these drudge-like personality attacks playing any role in our political system. And yet every time they do, they end up having a great influence on the outcome of the election. Why is that? Because these kind of attacks, even though they're petty, are really potent. I mean, they trigger important cultural and psychological and tribalistic identifying impulses. And so once there's really a Democratic nominee, the right-wing noise machine and all of its slimy appendages and all of their media partners are really going to gear up. Whether the nominee is Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, and it's going to be extremely ugly. because it's their only chance to win is to be that ugly, even uglier than normal. And when there is that degree of an assault that's that coordinated, and the candidate who is the target of it is refusing in essence to return fire along the same lines, I think it remains to be seen whether or not even those sort of more elevated and emphatic responses will be sufficient. I don't see how an election can be won, no matter what people think of John McCain's economic mastery or his view on Iraq, if he's allowed to be depicted as this honor-bound, upstanding, post-partisan man of principle, and the other candidate is, you know, a radical ally of the Weather Underground who is essentially a Muslim terrorist and a black Christian radical at the same time who hates America. You know, those are potent themes, and if that really is the framework that's going to take root, I'm not sure it's going to matter much what the rest of the issues are. I think there's a threshold, an equalizing point that has to be reached before the issues can start to matter as much as they ought to. As far as, you know, what you asked about progressive radio and other things, there are instances where people are talking about McCain's personal life and saying things like, if you want to talk about, you know, what really is the character of a person, you know, let's talk about the fact that when he returned from Vietnam and found his wife, who was, you know, in a near-fatal car accident, raising his children, and as a result of that accident was debilitated and several inches shorter and many, many pounds heavier. And when he returned and saw that, he almost immediately began having adulterous affairs and finally found a woman who was much, much younger and much, much prettier and much, 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 much richer. And he then dumped his wife, and his children didn't talk to him for several years as a result, and he married that woman whose family wealth then fueled his political career and kept him in the lap of luxury, this man of the regular people, for the last 3 decades. Then I think those things ought to be discussed, because if they're not, there's going to be this one-sided framework. The problem is that there is nothing comparable to the right-wing noise machine. I mean, progressive radio is a tiny, tiny fraction, and there's not that partnership forged with the establishment press that the right wing.
More and more of the mainstream media's questions.
It's getting better, but it's still nowhere equal. Yep.
I have 2 questions here. First of all, when you said that there was a one-sided fight, and it is a one-sided fight, but it's really kind of 2 forces. It's not only the right-wing machine, but the corporate media who joins the right-wing machine. Isn't it also in their economic interest to pursue their own media consolidation and, you know, to inflate their own salaries and money and all that, to be attacking the Democratic candidate, whoever the candidate is? And second question, the primary has produced record number of primary voters within the Democratic states. Does that signify anything in the future as we head to the general election?
Right. As far as the media is concerned, there's obviously all sorts of motivations as to why the establishment press has been hostile to the Democratic candidate and far more favorable to the Republican candidate. Some of it is personality-based, some of it is cultural, some of it is this sort of peer pressure, some of it is the fact that they're dependent on power, and power has been Republican power for the last 15 years, and some of it is ideological interest embedded in corporate ownership. Regardless of what the motivations are, that's just a fact that the establishment press is that way. You can sort of sit back in resignation and say, well, the cards are the deck is stacked against us because the establishment press hates us and loves them. Or you can say, we understand that obstacle and need to perfect and improve our strategies for how to get our messaging, for how to get better control of our messaging, notwithstanding those obstacles. Shaming individual reporters, shaming individual news outlets, having people who are Democrats and progressives who get media attention articulate these messages, raising lots of money and having smart and aggressive campaigns aimed at destroying John McCain's character if they're destroying Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's character in an honest but an aggressive way, are all things that can be done to circumvent that, even if they don't completely mitigate that disadvantage. So yeah, that obstacle is there, but it doesn't mean that it has to be as one-sided as it's been. As far as Democratic intensity, it's obviously much greater. I mean, the country hates Republicans. I mean, they just do. And they hate the war, and they hate economic management, and they hate George Bush and Dick Cheney. They hate everything about the Republican Party that you can't ask for a more discredited and toxic brand than the Republican Party is right now. And that's why John McCain, just like George Bush did in 2000, is running as a different kind of Republican and someone who deviates from his party and pushes them away. The reality is he doesn't. And especially on the issues that have caused Americans to hate that party, he's one of the most loyal foot soldiers for it. And so, yes, there is that intensity, but the polls aren't reflecting this advantage. And I think the reason is what I started off by discussing, which is that McCain is built into this sort of venerated figure, while Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, almost without the help of the press and the right now, are tearing each other down and doing the work for the Republicans, and that's only going to get much, much worse. Yeah, in the back there.
I agree with a lot of what you're talking about as far as the fact that image politics seems to be driving the debate in our country. But I think that one of the things that I'd like you to address that I haven't really heard you talk about that much yet is the fact that although, the country is furious and we're all very, very angry and everybody's, we're upset with the war, we're upset with everything else, the economy's doing terribly, that there doesn't seem to be a lot of action on the part of the public. And I see more apathy than I see anybody trying to drive this. I mean, the fact that, Obama's bullying and his, most recent comments are driving what's in the media right now as opposed to the things that are going on with torture and Iraq war itself. I mean, do you think that it's just that the media is so powerful that the normal people can't drive what's going on? Or, I mean, in my eyes, it just seems that there's so much apathy right now because I don't even know what, that's really causing the problems and that's what's allowing image politics rather than policy to be driving what's going on in the country.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question to answer, both in general and in this kind of a format, given time constraints and the like. And even if you had all the time in the world, it's a hard question to answer. Why is there so much apathy when there ought to be virtually none? I think the primary factor, to the extent that there is this pervasive apathy that you're describing, is the fact that people have given up on the idea that there's anything that they can do that actually matters, that the behemoth of the Beltway political and media establishment is so enormous and so removed from anything that they can affect that there's a resignation, in essence. And when Obama tried to explain his comments in the capital of elitism, that's essentially what he said, which is that what he means is that the reason why that kind of anger makes people move into the cultural realm away from political realm is because they stop believing that the political culture can never really do anything for them. Having said that, I think it's important not to overstate the extent of the apathy. This gentleman was just pointing out that there's been unprecedented amount of participation in Democratic primary, enormous numbers of new voters. For once, the youth vote is actually showing the promise that has been touted for it. There's enormous amounts of money that are being raised from small donors, even in times of economic difficulties, where people obviously feel like it's critically important to do what they can to change the political culture. The growth of online activism and blogs, I think, is another indication where hundreds of thousands of people every single day in their spare time, instead of sitting on their couch and watching crappy television, are turning on their computer and choosing to read detailed discussions of bills before subcommittees and how to affect change in our political system. So yeah, there's more apathy than it ought to be, but I think it's diminishing as a result of this anger towards the political class. Yep.
It seems to me that the Republicans understand something that we as Democrats unfortunately do not. And I'd like you to comment on it, and that is that as a species, we're not Homo sapiens. All of our discussion about policy this and policy that is predicated on the concept that we're Homo sapiens. We're not Homo sapiens. What drives us is emotions. All of us. In all of our major meetings, that's what the Republicans work on. They work on the idea of pushing people's emotional buttons. And we as Democrats, I think, need to understand that.
Right.
And our dialogue, our framing, etc., has to be built upon that concept that we're not Homo sapiens. It doesn't matter your 10-point plan on this or your 20-point plan on that. And the person that I think that's gotten closest to this is in the book The Political Brain by True Weston.
Yeah.
And I think we would all be much, much better off if we, took what he is saying to heart and also recognize that this concept of Homo sapiens is a recent construct and it's a fallacy.
Right. I mean, I think that's an important observation. Although I think it only takes you so far because there are all sorts of ways to package emotionally appealing messages. You can speak about 10-point policy plans and inspire all sorts of emotions. If you talk about the ways in which they lift people up and the way in which their lives are improved and the way in which it elevates the national interest, you can trigger strong emotional responses if you engage in personality building or personality destruction or triggering some of these themes. So I think you're absolutely right that one of the things the Republicans have done far better is tap into these emotional reservoirs that influence even the most rational among us. I think there's a squeamishness on the part of Democrats and liberals over the idea that, well, dealing with emotions is sort of manipulative, and it's much more noble and elevating to stay above the fray and strictly speak about matters in a rational manner. You can be passionate and you can trigger emotions and still speak the truth and still talk about policy in a very insightful and noble way. So they're not mutually exclusive. And I think you're right, though. There is this sense that packaging political messaging in a way that's designed to trigger passion is somehow untoward. And I agree that needs to be abandoned.
Point about Dukakis. Think about if Dukakis had answered that question, how most of us in this room would hopefully have answered that question, and how different things would have been. I mean, it was dishonest. The way he answered it was dishonest.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at the campaigns you've been talking about, since you talked about that, our campaigns, the Democratic campaigns, were often run by lawyers. And no reflection on you because you're a lawyer. Right. Now
an ex-lawyer.
We have David Axelrod, and Bush 1 had Atwater and Bush 2 had Karl Rove, and so I think that Axelrod is from the heartland. I think that Obama has shown that he can run a good campaign. So I feel more comfortable, and I don't want to get into this black and white. We're good, they're bad. I don't think that we're going to sell that in the king. I mean, he has a different approach to global warming. He has a different approach to immigration.
He granted immunity to torturers.
He has a different approach to other issues. So,
we're good and he's bad.
No, but the point is, you're going to go out into middle America. We people on the coast have to stop thinking about why the Republicans are evil and thinking we needed to be guided, in my opinion, because I'm an Obama supporter, by Obama. And he's building a broad coalition. And it's not going to be gun control, pro-choice, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
It's going to be all of America. That's what he's trying to do.
Right.
So I just think that we need to get away from this right-wing evil stuff.
Right. I don't think the issue is right-wing evil. I think the issue is that if the right advances arguments about who and what they are that are false, that they need to be rebutted. And I think that if the right advances arguments about who and what Democrats and progressives are, that those need to be rebutted as well. And so, I think the idea that you're describing is not a new idea in the sense that, for the most part, Democratic campaign consultants have essentially believed in exactly what you're describing, which is we need to get away from this divisive rhetoric. We need to show that we're not going to be as combative and as absolute as the right wing. We need to show that we're actually much more towards the middle. And what that's done is oftentimes it's muddled things, and it's made the Democrats unwilling to take on debates and arguments and fights that the right was actually pursuing. In an ideal world, I think you're absolutely right that it would be really nice if we just all sort of came together, and even when we disagreed on political issues, we could all sit down and in a very civil and constructive way work those out. That would be the ideal thing. But wishing that were so, or saying that you're going to abide by those rules even when the other side isn't, I think is a recipe for defeat, and I think that's what the last 30 years have demonstrated. So I didn't
say that. And just remember, Obama's consistently talked about wages and all kinds of other progressive issues. So, and as somebody else said, he sticks to his guns. So
yeah, that was me. I said that. I mean, I think.
He's made it very clear that his point is on style. And some people have criticized him on the right. They're saying that he's trying to sound nice, but he's really a liberal. So I think that he is, again, if you don't build a coalition in the United States, you don't win elections, especially if you're a Democrat.
Tell that to the
Right. I think the question is how to build the coalition. I mean, I think everyone is in favor of coalition building. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought one of the most telling incidents that was kind of lost in the Obama bowling week was when the Republicans pushed back on the McCain 100 years in Iraq, and you had the usual suspects, Mark Halperin, Politico, Mike Allen, whoever, saying, actually, you're right. You know, I don't know if he said this. And they basically jumped to McCain's defense. So my question is, even if Democrats push hard on it, do you think that, given McCain's love fest with the media, that they would turn on him, or is it going to be a constant media and Republicans defending McCain from here to November?
Well, like I said, I think shame is a very important tool in the arsenal when it comes to changing media behavior, because no matter how nefarious your perception of journalists might be, no matter how, you can take the more generous view that basically they do what they do because they're basically kind of empty and easily led people who aren't very smart and who have this, sort of adolescent mentality that guides them. Or you can go to the opposite extreme and say, no, they're tools of their corporate masters who, get dictates implicitly and explicitly to advance an ideology. Whatever it is, at the end of the day, they're still human beings who respond to all the things that normal and regular human beings do. And they don't go into work thinking about themselves as, sort of one-sided tools who are in the tank for McCain. That's not how they think of themselves. They don't want to think of themselves that way. And so if you can marshal the forces to make them realize that that's what they're doing, or to make them feel like people are thinking that about them, they will start to compensate. Not all of them, some of them to varying degrees, but there is a sense already that's out there that they know that there's this perception that they revere McCain, that they're uncritical when it comes to him. And so I think that behavior can be changed to some degree that way.
Real quick follow-up. I saw your blogging heads with Anna Marie Cox, and I've read her since the infamous barbecue when Holly Bailey's on the tire drinking wine or whatever.
Wine.
Well, yeah,
Right.
whatever it was. I mean, it seemed like she was more offended that anyone had the gall to question her integrity, and she didn't seem to think that she was in the tank.
Right. I mean, just because you spend weekends at the home of the person you're covering isn't any reason to think that you would be, too favorable or incapable of being objective. I mean, I don't know why anyone would think that, and that seemed to be her point. Yep.
I think that what happens is the media person who likes John McCain doesn't go the step further. Yeah, that's right. He said 100 years, but he meant like in Japan or Germany, where nobody's being shot, nobody's being killed. The question that's begged, I think, is, well, we're not there yet in Iraq. How long is it going to take us to get there before the 100 years clock starts?
Right.
And they won't ask him that.
Well,
because they like him.
I think one of the most telling examples has been of how the media works. Has been when McCain was going through the Middle East with his Middle East advisor Joe Lieberman, and he out of the blue, just all of a sudden, on multiple occasions in various different venues, started accusing Iran of training al-Qaeda operatives inside Iran and then sending them back into Iraq, something which I don't think even Bill Kristol claims is true, or maybe he does, but virtually nobody else. And Joe Lieberman whispered in his ear that he didn't really mean that, and without thinking, he mindlessly repeated what Joe Lieberman had whispered in his ear and said, I didn't mean that, I meant they're training Shiite extremists. Really, there were two distinct possibilities that ought to have been explored. Either he had no idea what he was talking about the most basic matters in his area of great expertise, which is, I don't know if you know this, foreign affairs and national security. McCain's an expert in that. Or he was engaged in the kind of deceit that the Bush administration has perpetrated for the last 8 years of linking whoever the enemy of the week is to al-Qaeda. This is the country or the faction that we hate. Did you know that they're working with al-Qaeda? Yeah, well, that was ultimately what they decided that they wanted to go with, because that was the sort of most benevolent. But what the media decided, and you shouldn't think this because I'm saying that this is what I think they were doing. You should think that this is what they were doing because they said that this is what they were doing. Is they essentially decided it wasn't a story because they know that McCain really knows a lot about the Middle East, so it couldn't be that he was mistaken. And they also know about him that he's a really honest guy. He's an honor-bound man of principle. He's a straight talker. And so it couldn't be that he was deceiving. Either it must have just been a sort of bizarre slip of the tongue that repeated itself 4 times in exactly the same way in the course of a week. And so they have this belief about who John McCain is, about his character, that really precludes them from reporting on him in an adversarial way because they think that if you have something that reflects negatively on him, on his character, by definition it must be false because his character is upstanding and good. And that is, the real challenge is to figure out how to overcome that. Yeah, we'll take a couple more and then, yep.
You called out a couple of pretty high-profile journalists on your blog, and for lame interviews or whatever, and they seem to respond very vehemently that you're full of it and they're very objective. And do you think they really meant that? Were they defensive? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think journalists and my perception of journalists is based on my observations of them and my interaction with them, are unbelievably thin-skinned. I mean, they hate to be criticized. It really bothers them. Even, there are times when I mention a journalist literally in passing, because I'm quoting something that just happens to include his or her name, and I'll get an email from them, vehemently objecting to the horrible personal attack that I waged on them when I hadn't even realized that I had even mentioned them. I mean, they were literally quoted in passing. And yet, I have noticed that when journalists are targeted for that kind of criticism, they do start modifying their behavior, even subconsciously. One of the things that Anna Marie Cox had said in that Blogging Heads discussion that I had was out of the blue. She started in this lengthy confessional / testimonial about how her writing is suffering because now whenever she goes to write something, she thinks about whether or not it's going to provoke liberal bloggers to gang up on her, as she put it, and that she finds herself suppressing the things that she'd want to say whenever she fears that will happen. To me, that seemed like a really good thing. She was saying it like it was some grave loss to journalism, like liberal bloggers are destroying journalism because they're making journalists think twice about whether or not what they're saying is actually true or persuasive. To me, that seemed like a good thing. And so I do think that it is having that effect. Like I said, some are probably impervious to it. Some are too pompous to care. Others are too set in their ways. But for many, many journalists, the more you pound at them about these behaviors, the more they'll think twice when engaging in that behavior the next time. And I think that's one of the most effective tools. Yeah, in the back there.
I'd just like to get your take on what seems like a virtual media blackout on the torture meetings that just came out recently with Cheney and Rice and all of them together and deciding what torture we were actually going to use. I'm just stunned that this isn't a major scandal.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can say about that is whenever you think that the media in this country has reached the floor and that they just can't go any lower, that that's not possible, they always find a way to go lower, usually a lot lower. And I mean, it is shocking. That part, I always think that I've actually steeled myself to this reality, and yet every time I see it, I'm amazed by it. I mean, what else can one say about this? I mean, it really was just revealed conclusively that the President of the United States and almost all of his top aides sat around planning down to the detail what are by all measures illegal methods of torture. I mean, there's just no other way to describe it. And yet it barely created, a ripple. I mean, it just didn't. I mentioned a couple of days ago that I rarely watch, cable news, except when I'm traveling. I'm in a hotel and kind of just subjected to it inadvertently. And I don't think I flipped through all the channels continuously for a few hours on several occasions. I literally don't think I heard a single time those matters being discussed. I mean, John Yoo, the memo that he wrote that was recently disclosed, literally said in it, in a footnote, as you know, in a recent memorandum, we concluded that the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States is inapplicable to, quote, domestic military operations inside the United States. I mean, that is a declaration that the U.S. government suspended the Bill of Rights in secret And I read a few articles on it, a couple AP articles on it, maybe a couple short New York Times and Washington Post articles. And other than that, I mean, there was no discussion of it whatsoever. And I can guarantee you that, and there'll be polls that will show this eventually, that probably 20 to 30 times more Americans will know that Barack Obama bowled a 38. I don't even think he bowled a 38, but that's what 37. I'm in the ignorant minority there, but we're going to know that he bowled that score. Then we'll know that the President of the United States and his top aides met to choreograph how torture was going to be used, or that the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, had been suspended. I mean, those facts just to me speak for themselves.
Did Congress express outrage about that, the Democratic leadership? I mean,
among others, yeah. Yep.
Well,
Yeah.
Even if we acknowledge that these more visceral issues like bowling scores or what people drink in bars is of greater interest to the press and perhaps more attractive to the public, issues do get into the news. There's certain things that people talk about as issues. There's one that I don't see getting very much attention at all, and I think particularly in light of this question about these recent discussions of torture that were disclosed. I'm very interested to know how any of these candidates would choose a cabinet, how they would seek advisors. I mean, I'd like to know who, but that's not even that important at this point. And we never hear about that. I would be interested to know why you think that's the case. Is it too much political liability to bring other personalities in? Is it just not interesting to the press? Or?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, who one's cabinet members are going to be is obviously a significant part of what kind of president a person will be. I don't know if it's too early and those questions don't get answered. I don't know if candidates don't like to answer those questions until they know whether the person is interested and I doubt very many candidates think very extensively about that. I've heard a little bit about it. I think some candidates have said that they would consider putting people like, Barack Obama or Richard Lugar or people like that in their cabinet.
Usually it's sort of a press parlor game that gets to the candidate and they have to comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how substantive that is, precisely for the reasons that I just identified. I mean, I think even that gets into the sort of politics as celebrity. Colin Powell might be the new, Secretary of Defense, or is Condi Rice going to be Vice President? That stays on the level of celebrity like chatter, and I don't think it goes, very far. Yep.
Can the Democrats or progressives overcome the situation described without a serious investment in media? Just one example, Politico was a relatively minor investment by Al Britton. I mean, they're everywhere. And it just seems to me that a lot of money has been raised for this campaign, but virtually nothing has been raised for alternative media. We spend a lot of money to our cable networks, but our cable providers, and we have not a single channel that we can go and get anything like Fox, or we get maybe an hour, 2 hours a day from MSNBC, and they have to balance it with the 5 shows for every one that Olbermann has, so that the ratings are equal.
Right.
I don't really see, you talk all the time about, we have to deal with the media or try and convince them, but it would be so much more effective to me, look at Fox, to spend some money and have an alternative.
I agree. It's a great point. And I think not only Fox, but right-wing radio, the entire industry of right-wing authors who are subsidized and always have the guarantee that huge numbers of their books will be purchased to inflate their sales figures, to make them look like successful authors, which then results in them going on all sorts of shows. So I think that there are factors outside of the control and culpability of progressives that are obstacles. But I think there are things that could be done by opponents of the right wing much better to mitigate these obstacles. And I think that creating alternative media and message machines is one of the most important. Clearly, blogs are an effort to fill that gap, and they've succeeded to some degree. It's still an incipient medium. I mean, it's still growing in all sorts of ways, but the imbalance is vast, and that's just a reality. But I think that
10, 15 people all the time. It works, but it's nothing like having Fox, a cable channel network. I mean, it's just a much slower process, and it seems like it would take a long time to be as effective. to networks or alternative media, or just following the Politico model. I don't see why progressives can't raise enough money to do something like that.
Well, it takes a fair amount of money, and there's not a huge number of people who have that kind of capital who are willing to invest it. But you're right. I think it's probably one of the best ways to spend that sort of money. I mean, I do think that it's important to realize that even when liberal media or progressive media outlets exist, they're still subject to the same sort of stigmatization and sense that these aren't really serious media. I mean, there are left-wing and liberal media outlets. I mean, and there are magazines and there are talk radio stations and there are blogs. So there is a growing framework, a growing structure, but the imbalance is still enormous, and there's all kinds of obstacles.
MSNBC, if GE was interested in making money, they would replicate Oberman throughout the entire network instead of trying to keep balancing him with opposite.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's the one show that has grown, amazingly, and then finally they canceled Tucker Carlson, who for 5 years had no ratings at all, and there were all kinds of obvious possibilities that they could have used to fill that slot. Important and rising liberal personalities. Rachel Maddow, of course, was mentioned a lot as a possibility. She would have been superb, and the whole Oberman audience would have been a natural. Would have naturally migrated to her show. And what did they do? They took David Gregory and created, the 4000s, let's talk about the election horse race show and stuck it into that slot. So they're clearly, if it were just, I think there's a question, do we want media outlets to be driven purely by market considerations? Even if you answer that question in the affirmative, clearly that's not what's happening, because there are huge gaps that are waiting to be filled with liberal and progressive programming to take advantage of the kinds of intensity levels that we've been discussing that just aren't being fulfilled, and one does have to ask why that is. Yep.
I just have a question. I'm from San Francisco, and I'm
The capital of elitism?
Yeah, exactly. I'm relocating to New York, and I'm glad that I was here temporarily, because I had been reading your blog almost from the beginning, long before you went to Salon. And I always thought, it's so funny, because I've always told my parents and friends that I see several progressive bloggers on the television, like Keith Olbermann, and I rarely, if ever, I can't remember if you were, I think there was one time or a couple of times. Why? This is my question. It's very simple. How come you're not on television more often? You're engaging, you're personable. I mean, I was expecting like some two-headed, scary thing, because I thought it was horrifying in person.
I'm on my best behavior, but I'm at the beginning of my book tour. In 2 weeks, I'll be like that. But
inner circle? Is it just?
I think there's numerous factors. I mean, for one thing, I've been writing politically only for about 2 years now, and so I haven't tried to and don't want to develop all sorts of relationships with the people about whom I'm writing, which includes media insiders. And so I don't pursue that, and I actually keep a distance from that on purpose, because I want to maintain my objectivity, and I don't want to be reluctant to criticize those who merit criticism. That's a big part of it. The other thing is, there are people who have a lot of discretion about who goes on television. And when it comes time to deciding who that's going to be, someone who spends a fair amount of their time singling those people out and hurling them out for pretty aggressive criticism isn't necessarily going to be on the top of that list. I think there are other factors. In order to go on television on those shows, you need to be willing and eager to express yourself with great concision to sort of fulfill these pre-existing scripts of conventional wisdom. And if you're willing to do that, it's pretty interchangeable who goes on. If you're writing things that don't quite fit into that, you're not going to be a natural candidate. Part of it is I don't actually want to go on shows where I'm one of 3 or 4 or even 2 talking heads where I have 20 seconds to answer questions for about 2 minutes and then thank you very much, and because I just think it's purposeless and a little bit degrading. And finally, I spend a lot of my time in Brazil because my partner is Brazilian, and so there are times when I do get those invitations and I'm not able to accept them just because of the logistics. So all those factors combine, but I think there are a lot of other ways, and probably a lot of other better ways, to find a method to have your ideas heard, and I prefer to be a little bit patient about it and pursue those methods in a way that is the least compromising path. I don't want to jump on MSNBC just to be on it, and then have to sort of morph into the things that I think are so harmful. So it's a lot of different factors, but I appreciate the question. 2 more, and then we'll end. Yep.
In many ways, in terms of the big picture, you're preaching to the converted, at least with me. But my question is, what can rank and file people do, particularly if our putative representatives and leadership are, frankly, nitwits? I mean, that's basically what you're saying. And in many respects, somewhat out of touch. What can rank and file people do to try to change some of these dynamics?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I was at this event this week that I mentioned today, and I'm constrained in what I can say about it because it was an off-the-record event, and that was a condition that I accepted. But I was able to go to this event where there were about 20 to 25 members of Congress and a bunch of Democratic consultant and strategist types, some of whom you would know and dislike, and the idea was, well, let's have a discussion about some of the tactics and themes of the book and about what bloggers are doing and have to offer. And this was not just, the progressive caucus, the kind of people who would be part of the choir. Some of them were, kind of long-term moderate. Some of them were freshmen who are still a little bit teetering about what they're going to be. Some were actually blue dogs who had voted in favor of or against the House FISA bill because they wanted to vote for the Rockefeller-Cheney one. And they were incredibly receptive, not in the politically artificial way of pretending to be, but they stayed for a couple of hours. I was, as blunt and emphatic as I could possibly be, as I am on my blog when I was talking to their faces about what I thought they were doing that was so counterproductive. And they wanted to know what blogs have to offer, how they can work better with blogs, because they're starting to realize that the path down which they've been marching behind these Beltway Democratic strategists is a path of failure. And they've become increasingly open to interacting with people outside of the Beltway, realizing that blogs are a great resource, because what blogs are is a mechanism for citizens to work cooperatively in order to make themselves heard. And so, when just a couple of weeks ago I was writing about the speech that the Attorney General gave, where he made all sorts of false claims about 9/11, and I wanted Lee Hamilton, the vice chair of the 9/11 Commission, to go on the record to say that what the Attorney General had said about the 9/11 Commission, about the 9/11 attack, was false. And I called Lee Hamilton's office, and I spoke to his representative. First he said he wouldn't comment because he didn't hear the speech. Then I said, well, I'm happy to send the speech to you. I have audio of the speech. You can listen to it. How about commenting then? He said, no, I'm not going to comment on it because I didn't hear the speech. And I said, never? And they basically said, no, he's never going to comment. And on my blog, I encourage people to write emails to Congressman Hamilton, encouraging him in their own words and passionately but civilly to comment. And he was deluged with emails. And I know that because I was, and a lot of them were CC'd to me. And several days later, I was contacted by his office, and they said he has a comment, and the comment was that what the Attorney General said was something that was completely unfamiliar to him, and that helped to spawn the controversy further, to the point where now it's an ongoing controversy. And so that kind of activism, when it is focused and done constructively and in a coordinated way, can make a difference. The same thing happens when that energy is directed to individual reporters who then modify their behavior. They and the members of Congress who were there last night are very well aware of the criticism that we all collectively voice about what they're doing, and they are sensitive to it, they're concerned by it, they're disturbed by it. Everything that you're not sure about when you're doing it in terms of if it's being heard, it is being heard, because numbers are loud and effective. And I think that kind of collective action in a slow and gradual and incremental way, though a very real way, can make a difference and is making a difference. Yep, last one over there.
You made, I just want to get back to one of the themes in your book. You made the argument that in order to neutralize these sort of petty, rapid personality-based attacks, that they need to be applied equally and consistently to the right. I'm wondering, is there a concern that 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, by taking up this venture, and an unintended consequence of that might be that you create a network, a coordinated network, which then may mutate into some kind of a monster that you might not be able to control, like the religious right, something that 20 years from now is gonna make this side look really, really bad.
Right. I think it's a really good question, and it's a very real concern. And I guess the way that I would address it is this. In an ideal world, I mean, I would love to be able to go on to the computer every day and write about purely substantive issues. I mean, I would love to be able to sit there and write about why the defenses that the administration has offered to their lawbreaking with regard to surveillance are completely frivolous, and have people read what I'm writing and judge them on the merits, or write about why telecom amnesty is so unjust and eviscerates the rule of law, or about why our policy in Iraq has been so irrational and contradictory, and have those debates and to the exclusion of all others. But that isn't the world that we live in, and you can make those arguments all you want, and until you address those personality concerns and these kind of defamatory attacks and degrading drudge-like themes, none of that is going to matter. And so, yeah, there is a risk that if you start engaging in those tactics purely to neutralize them, that you can kind of get addicted to them if they start working and create a monster among opponents of the right that turns into sort of a replica of all the parts of things about the right that we all dislike. That is a concern. But I think the risk of that happening is vastly outweighed by what will happen if that isn't done, which is that the right will continue to win elections and will continue to be a country that lives under the rule of this very radical faction. You know, I have concerns that if Democrats take over the White House this year, as I hope they do, and maintain and enlarge their control of both houses of Congress, that kind of monopoly on political power will mean that some of the excesses that we've seen over the last 8 years in Republican hands will transfer to Democratic hands. I mean, I'm concerned about that as well. But to me, the risk of that happening is vastly outweighed by the risk of allowing the right wing to continue to be in political power, and I'll deal with that risk, is the way I think about it at least, at the time, if and when it happens, which is then I'll start working against that as well. And that, I think, is the best answer, at least, that I can give to your question. So I think we're going to conclude the discussion, and again, I really appreciate everybody coming. The questions were great, which makes everything really interesting and provocative for me, and so I'm really happy about that and thankful for that. I think I'm going to be doing a book signing. I don't know where, but I'll be doing that somewhere right after this is done, and if you want to just chat or talk or whatever, feel free to stay around, and we'll do that too. Thank you very much.
Glen Greenwald is a former constitutional law attorney. He's now a contributing writer at Salon. His political reporting and analysis have appeared in the New York Times,